Hello! We are joined today by Haruki. I'm actually not sure if you can even see him, but he is over there. And this is a bit of a more serious video for my channel, I suppose. But I kind of wanted to talk today about trigger warnings for book content. So there's a lot of differing opinions about trigger warnings and how they should be handled, if they should be included, that kind of thing. So I asked some of you on Instagram and I got a few responses there, and so this is going to be me sort of chatting about my various thoughts and sharing some of the thoughts that you shared with me about trigger warnings. This is not going to come to any epiphany or anything because I'm still not 100% sure how I feel one way or another, but I did think that it was an interesting and important discussion. This has come up because I recently did a couple of videos where I was recommending books that I find comforting and thought that you might also find comforting, and one of the responses to that video was to give some trigger warnings for the content for one of those books. And it made me realise that if I'm recommending books that are going to comfort you, I should probably warn you as well about any content that might be the opposite of comforting. And so I went back and I did comments for each of those videos, listing as many trigger warnings as I could remember for each of the books that I recommended. It still wasn't an exhaustive list, and that kind of prompted me to make this video because I wonder what to do about trigger warnings when I'm recommending books, because triggers are such a personal thing, and there are the big ones that lots of people are aware of, like sexual violence or physical violence or mental abuse, and those are all unfortunately familiar topics that it would be easy to give trigger warnings for. But then there's the more niche type areas. So for example, someone that I know suffers with trichotillomania, which I'm not going to get into, but it's a very niche and specific form of OCD. And I recently recommended a book to them. It was the Keeper of the Lost Cities series by Shannon Messenger, and the protagonist in that story suffers with a very mild presentation of trichotillomania. So I told my friend this and said, you know, I think you'll love this book, but it's got this in it. And the reason I bring that up particularly is because, one, it's a really, really specific diagnosis of OCD. So unless you know what it is, you probably don't know what it is. You've probably never come across it or even heard of it before. So that being the case, you wouldn't be able to give a trigger warning for it. But also, what I found interesting about that is that when I told my friend that that was in that particular story, it actually made her more likely to read it because she didn't think it would be triggering, and she was actually interested to read a book with that representation in it because it's so unique and not much talked about or known about. So it's difficult because I don't want somebody to pick up a book on my recommendation, potentially even buy that book on my recommendation, start to read it, be triggered by it, and have to put it down. So not only have they wasted their money on a book that I've recommended, but they've also potentially been triggered by the content of that book. But then at the same time, I am not experienced enough or knowledgeable enough to be able to give full lists of triggers in books, and I don't necessarily want my reviews to turn into that for a number of reasons. Firstly, it won't apply to everybody. that's one of the minor reasons, but it's a point to make. 2, some people find trigger warnings spoilery, and to a certain extent they are. Usually it's not a massive plot point, but it can be. For example, I won't mention which book it was or anything, but I read a book that last year that dealt with death of a grandparent, and I found that somewhat triggering for me, in kind of a good way. And that's the other thing about triggers, is that they can be a good thing. They can help you to deal with something that you didn't know that you were dealing with. But I was already in a pretty good place with my grief at the time that I read that book. So if I hadn't been, I might have found it more difficult. But as it was, I actually found it really insightful and helpful in some ways. So there's that aspect of it as well. And again, if I'd have known about that trigger before going into the book, it would have been a massive spoiler, because it's a massive plot point that kind of carries through the story, and you don't have it confirmed until quite a way into that particular book. So that would have been a massive spoiler. So those are a couple of reasons that I don't necessarily want to share trigger warnings for every single book I ever mention on my channel. And again, I'm not necessarily going to recognise all of the triggers, and I won't necessarily be able to give an exhaustive list of every possible thing that could be triggering in a particular book. It would take a long time, it would make my videos really long, it would potentially add more of a negative sort of aspect to my videos. Not that trigger warnings are negative, but normally if something's triggering, it's because it's going to be potentially upsetting or distressing for you. So I don't necessarily want to bring that tone to my videos, and I then worry that if I did miss a specific trigger because I'm just not familiar with that specific thing, and somebody has taken my recommendation, listened to my list of trigger warnings, gone, great, that doesn't have my trigger on it, I'm going to read it, and then they pick it up and go, well actually yes it does have my trigger in it, why didn't Sophia mention this? And it's because it's just not something I would ever think of. And I do try to be thoughtful, I do try to be a thoughtful and a critical reader as much as I can, but I'm only one person, I only have one set of life experiences, and so I'm not going to recognise every trigger. So historically what I've done is only mentioned trigger warnings if a book is particularly dark, and the one that jumps out to me here is The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin, which is an incredibly dark book and has just about every trigger warning you could possibly imagine in it, I think. And so the first time I reviewed that book, I did give a pretty long list of trigger warnings for it, but even in that I probably missed some things. So I don't really know, I don't have an answer to this question. Let's go through a few of the things that you said to me on Instagram when I asked. So I specifically asked, what do you think about trigger warnings? So I got a variety of comments. I think it's kind, they're helpful to prepare your mindset for a book or to avoid a book altogether. I appreciate trigger warnings. For me, I don't feel like I need them, but I know they're essential to others, so I don't mind them. Put them in books, end of. I don't see them as spoilers like some people do. I appreciate it every time someone does it, and I'm appalled some books don't do it. Enables a better reading experience for the people with triggers, and if you don't have triggers you can just skip them if you think that it's going to be spoilery. I'm not a sensitive reader. I do know that some content can cause issues for some. I don't mind books having trigger warnings, and when I see the area that shows the trigger warnings, I skip past that part. Understand the desire or need for trigger warnings, but I prefer doing without to avoid spoilers. I think they should be made easily available so people can search them for their triggers. I think giving trigger warnings is important because people should be aware of the content of a book, but it can be difficult to know which trigger warnings to give. So it seems like a lot of you have a lot of the same thoughts that I do. I definitely think that if somebody is aware that something is going to be triggering for them and they want to avoid books with that particular content, then they should be able to find that information relatively easily. And when I was compiling my list of triggers to go in the comments of those comfort read videos, it actually wasn't that easy. So I included the ones that I could remember. Some of those books I hadn't read for quite a while, so they weren't necessarily fresh in my mind, and it was a little bit difficult. So I took to Google and tried to find some trigger warnings there, and it wasn't necessarily readily available. It wasn't particularly easy to find the answers to that questions, but I suppose if you are looking for a specific trigger, then that might be easier to find. If you're looking for a specific trigger rather than just triggers in general, that might be easier. So like I said, I'm not going to be coming to any conclusions in this video, but I would really love to continue the conversation with you in the comments. Ultimately, I think that it's really important that people who are aware that certain content is just out of the question for them should be able to find that information easily so that they can avoid specific books, so that they're not triggered by that particular content, but weighing that up with giving people the opportunity to experience books with content that perhaps they weren't expecting from that book, but that's actually in some ways healing for them. And then weigh that up from the other side, where people who are publishing books or writing books or reviewing books not being able to give a full list of triggers for that particular book, because anybody could be triggered by almost anything, and that makes it a real minefield. So where is that middle ground? Where is that middle ground between making sure that people feel safe reading a book but not limiting the ability for that book to have a positive impact on that person, and not causing anxiety, frankly, for the people who potentially need to give that information? Because I have to admit that when I realised that I should have given those trigger warnings for those two particular videos, I had a moment of anxiety there and was like, oh no, what if I've recommended something to someone that they're going to pick up thinking it's going to comfort them, and then it's got a trigger in it that's going to make them really upset? And that's not my intention at all. So yeah, it's a really, really difficult subject, I think, and I, like I said, would be really interested to hear more of your thoughts on it. So please do keep the conversation going in the comments section, and if there's a particular way that you would like me to deal with trigger warnings, if you want me to deal with trigger warnings, then let me know. I just feel a little anxious about, you know, including them because I might miss something. So anyway, that's my little ramble for today. I'd love to hear your thoughts, and that's it for this one. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video and want to see more like this from me, then do think about hitting that subscribe button, and I hope to see you again soon. Thanks. Bye.